This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. What's your favorite food? Oftentimes, it's food we ate growing up. For me, it was my mother's potato bhaji and her chicken curry, which I still cannot replicate. I grew up eating Indian food almost every day. So when I went away to college, the cafeteria food was the worst. Hot sauce saved me from all the blandness, a discovery that meant the freshman 15 eventually got me too. Now fast forward 20 years and my diet is mostly westernized, but the food I enjoy eating the most is the food my parents once prepared, my connection to a culture I know as a second-generation American. Now, South Asians make up 23% of the world's population, and among us is a startling statistic. Researchers say South Asians have an increased chance of developing cardiovascular disease and diabetes. In fact, 6 out of 10 cardiovascular disease patients around the world are of South Asian descent. 6 out of 10. That's according to the MASALA study. What's the cause? Is it the food we eat, genetics, social determinants, or several factors? Today, Where We Live, we learn about the research focused on South Asians living in America. Coming up, we talk to a co-investigator at the MASALA study. Since 2010, the study has followed participants' blood pressure, insulin resistance, and other measures to understand diabetes and cardiovascular risk among this group. And coming up later, we hear from a food studies scholar at NYU and talk to a Connecticut dietitian. You can join us too, share a comment on our Facebook page, or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. Joining us first on Zoom is Dr. Nilesh Shah, a cardiologist and faculty at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine and co-investigator at the MASALA study. Dr. Shah, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, tell us what the MASALA study stands for. And when we think about the word masala, that word means spice mixture.
That's right. So the MASALA study, which stands for the Mediators of Atherosclerosis in South Asians Living in America study, is a community cohort of South Asian adults who are primarily first-generation immigrants that was started, as you said, in 2010 and have been followed since then.
Now, atherosclerosis, can you define that for us?
Sure. So atherosclerosis is the process of the development of plaques in the arteries of the body. We most commonly think about it as it pertains to plaques and blockages developing in the heart arteries, but this can be anywhere in the body.
I had referenced that 60% of the world's heart disease patients are South Asians, and South Asians also have the highest death rate from heart disease in the U.S. compared to other ethnic groups. And so tell us about how you got involved and what's behind this startling statistic.
So my involvement in this space and work really started from an early age and seeing what was going on in my community. I grew up in the South Asian community of Chicago. And as I went from childhood through adolescence into young adulthood, I would hear more and more stories of people in my family and people in our community experiencing heart disease and heart disease related events, people who needed to go to the hospital and get surgery for heart disease. And it just became more and more common. And so as I decided that I wanted to train in medicine, this became a particular area of interest of mine because I reflected on what my experience was growing up in my own family. And some of the statistics that you mentioned, they are indeed startling, and some more that continue to really motivate me is that the South Asian community tends to experience not only more heart disease at a higher proportion than other communities, but at younger ages too. On average, heart disease starts to appear about 10 years earlier in people of South Asian descent compared with other groups. And this really prompted me to try to understand why and what we can do about it. So the bulk of the available information we have about heart disease in the South Asian community really comes from larger population-based research studies with an increasing number of increasing focus on more specific communities in the diaspora, in the UK and the US, but also a growing research effort in South Asian countries themselves. This evidence suggests that a large bulk of this excess risk for heart disease that is experienced by people who are South Asian can be attributed to the usual risk factors we think about for heart disease, things like diabetes and poorer quality diets, not getting enough physical activity, and high blood pressure. But then there's also some component that's not fully explained by some of these traditional risk factors, and that is an active area of study. I don't know that we've completely understood exactly what those factors are, but their hypothesis is that it's a combination of things like social determinants of health, and another active area of study is whether there is a genetic component or not. It's not exactly clear whether the answer to that is yes or no, but it is something that is actively being investigated by several groups.
Now, when we think about risk, you'd mentioned, diet can be a risk factor. But I wonder if you can talk about, even when we think about weight and body mass index or BMI, and what this 12-year study has found related to BMI and indicators among South Asians of who are at risk of cardiovascular disease. What can you tell us?
So, body composition, body weight, and BMI are important considerations when thinking about what are the risk factors for heart disease and heart-related complications. And here in the US, we often encounter a standard categorization of BMI to identify an individual as being normal weight or perhaps being overweight, or a medical categorization of obese. And the information we've learned from the MASALA study and other work suggests that people who are South Asian tend to have a higher risk for developing heart disease related risk factors related to body weight and body composition at lower BMIs. And so, for example, the standard categorization for a BMI in which somebody would potentially be labeled overweight starts at a BMI of 25 kilograms per meter squared. And what we've learned is that that inflection point, that point where we start to see increased risk, may be lower for individuals who are South Asian, perhaps somewhere around 23 kilograms per meter squared. That is another area of active investigation, what exactly that threshold or cut point might optimally be. And it may be different for different South Asian populations based on the context in which individuals live. But the bottom line is that the epidemiology suggests that the risk for heart disease and the risk for heart disease related risk factors like diabetes and high blood pressure, which are related to body weight and composition, starts at a lower BMI in South Asian individuals. And in parallel to that, there is this phenotype or this characteristic of South Asian individuals that tends to be seen more often, which is this pattern of people who would be considered normal weight but are metabolically abnormal. So have things like diabetes or high triglycerides, which are all factors that are related to heart health and are traditionally thought of being related to body composition that is suboptimal, like being overweight or being obese. But those factors tend to emerge even among normal weight in individuals who are South Asian.
That's an important finding, as you mentioned. It's still ongoing, but when we think about, if a doctor is seeing someone who's of South Asian descent and they have a normal weight, thinking that they may not be at risk for a particular disease, but there are other factors at play, and that's why it's important to learn more about the foods that someone's eating and other risk factors. Dr. Shah?
Yeah, I agree completely that the implications in part are that when someone like myself who sees patients in the clinic encounters a patient who is South Asian, perhaps I should be prompted to screen or look for other heart disease related risk factors, even if a person would be categorized as being at normal weight.
Now, another finding from the MASALA study, again, this is it's been going on for 12 years now, is where people of South Asian descent may store their body fat, and why that can be a risk factor as well, Dr. Shah.
Yes, that's an important point, and perhaps one of the predominant findings of the MASALA study so far. So when individuals store fat in their body, most commonly that tends to be what's called subcutaneous fat, or fat that's stored under the skin. The MASALA study of the original participants who have been followed since 2010 did special imaging of the participants to better understand where fat is stored in people who identify as South Asian. And there was a higher amount of fat that was identified on average stored in what are called ectopic areas, or essentially fat that's not really where it's supposed to be. And the areas that stood out in the participants who are South Asian tended to be fat that was visceral, so fat that surrounded the organs, particularly in the abdomen, as well as fat that was building up in the liver. And there is now, over the last few years, increasing evidence that this kind of ectopic fat or visceral fat that's stored around the organs, stored in the liver, is particularly contributory to the development of metabolic abnormalities like diabetes and contributes to the development of atherosclerosis and heart disease risk. And so the why is still an ongoing question. Why does this tend to occur in individuals who are South Asian, perhaps more than other groups? We don't yet have an answer to that, but it does help us better understand why this population may experience the excess risk.
Now, I understand that today, as we're learning about the MASALA study with Dr. Nilesh Shah, cardiologist and faculty at Northwestern University, co-investigator of the 12-year MASALA study, I understand, Dr. Shah, that this study is now expanding to include second-generation South Asians and also looking to expand when we talk about South Asians, not just focusing on Indians, but also Pakistani and Bangladeshi Americans. Tell us more.
That's exactly right. So the MASALA program, just to take a step back, the MASALA program started in 2010, led by Dr. Alka Kanaya at the University of California in San Francisco and Dr. Namrata Kandula here at Northwestern. Started as a cohort of primarily first-generation South Asian Americans. And the original enrollment in the program, most individuals identified as being Indian. The first cohort of MASALA participants were enrolled from about 2010 to 2013. And then individuals came back for a second visit about 2016 to 2018 and are now coming back for their third visit through about 2024. And the focus right now in this third visit is to better understand the changes in heart structure and blood vessel health or vascular health that may occur over time in individuals who are South Asian. But as the study proceeded, there was increasing recognition of a couple of things. First, as you said, there is a growing population of second-generation South Asians. Of this first cohort of South Asian individuals who immigrated to the U.S. somewhere between the 1970s through the 1990s, as these individuals became older and started having families, now we have a second generation cohort of individuals. And the hypothesis is that these individuals likely have different factors that influence their health compared to their first generation immigrant parents. They grew up in different environments, they may have different social determinants. And so one active ongoing effort is to recruit and enroll the adult children of the original MASALA participants into the MASALA second generation study, which is actively ongoing and will try to understand not only what are the unique factors that may contribute to the heart health of second generation South Asians, but how does the health of parents influence their kids and how does the health of kids potentially influence their parents? And in parallel, it was recognized as the cohort started to grow, there was some secondary enrollment that occurred during the original first 10 years of the study. It was recognized that even within the South Asian community, it is not a uniform community. There's quite a bit of variability and variation across multiple different kinds of identities in the South Asian community. And one of the identities that particularly stood out was individuals who identified as Indian versus Pakistani versus Bangladeshi. And so in this current wave, there's also a parallel new enrollment of participants into the MASALA program who are primarily identifying as Pakistani or Bangladeshi to supplement the information that we have about Indian Americans.
It's really interesting, and I understand by 2024, the cohort will include about 2,300 participants in California, Illinois, and the New York area. Again, you're hearing Dr. Nilesh Shah, cardiologist and faculty at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine, co-investigator at the MASALA study. Now, the MASALA study website has a health tip section on a range of topics, like how to eat low carb as a vegan, a healthy South Asian diet, how to order healthy at Indian restaurants, and also a carb counting tool. But the website also has Punjabi fitness videos by Dilpreet Batal. Let's take a listen.
Breathe in. Breathe out. They frequency switch custom side. Breathe in. Breathe out.
And the link to that MASALA study website is on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Coming up, we'll continue talking with Dr. Shah and hear from a food studies scholar at NYU. You can join us too, especially if you're of South Asian descent. If you think about your lifestyle, the food you eat, and your ties to your culture, all important in this conversation. You can join us as well. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're learning about the MASALA study. It started in 2010 to better understand why people of South Asian ancestry living in the U.S. have higher cardiovascular disease risk compared to other racial and ethnic groups. With us is study co-investigator Dr. Nilesh Shah, cardiologist and faculty at Northwestern School of Medicine. Now, diet can be a risk factor for heart disease, but avoiding certain foods is easier said than done. There's a connection to what we prepare for ourselves and for our families, because food can be an important part of our culture. My next guest is a food studies scholar who wrote a book about the relationship between food and identity among working-class Hindu Bengali Americans. Krishnendu Ray is professor of food and nutrition studies at New York University, also author of the book, The Migrant's Table, Meals and Memories in Bengali American Households. And Krishnendu is also a former faculty member at the Culinary Institute of America. Krishnendu, welcome to our show.
Thanks a lot, Lucy.
Krishnendu, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your book and how you looked into the changing food habits of Bengali immigrants to the U.S.
Yeah, so it's a book based on a survey of 126 households who are mostly what Dr. Shah was talking about, first generation Bengali Americans. And they mostly came between the 1960s, specifically 1970s into the 1990s. And so what it looked at was a survey of Kolkata Bengalis before migration, which is the city called Calcutta previously, and then a survey of their food habits, what changes, what changed, what did not change, what did people think about it after their migration. And most of these people migrated between the 1970s and the 1990s.
Mm. You're a little hard to hear, Krishnendu. If you could sit a little bit closer to your device so our listeners can hear you well. No problem. So when we think about how eating patterns change after migration, both day to day versus, the special holidays, what did you find?
Yeah, so one of the interesting findings was that breakfast, in terms of the daily cycle, changed most dramatically. And while dinner became more conserving Bengali in a Bengali household, meaning dinner would be typically fish, rice, a sautéed green, and dal, which is legumes, all forms of legumes, which is very common in a Bengali American household. In contrast to dinner, breakfast became much more convenience-oriented. Toasts, breakfast cereals, often sweet, of course, breakfast cereals. And that was driven by two things as I talked to people. One was convenience, because early morning, long commutes, children going to school, families going to work, kind of put pressure on households, especially in the morning. And most of these people were middle-class people who had migrated from a context where cheap labor was available. So, say a typical whole wheat chapati would have been made at home, but by domestic help. And once they came into the United States and once they migrated into the United States, that help went away. So the pressure for convenience for breakfast food, convenience food became much more acute. And there was a second sense, a psychological sense, that most of these migrants were looking at breakfast as a food to prepare themselves for the American world. They were almost like bracing themselves. So they were ready to open the door into the American world with breakfast. And in some ways, dinner was the obverse. They were ready to shut the door behind them and create a cocoon, a cultural cocoon for dinner in the evening. So if you just looked at breakfast, you would say these people had totally assimilated. But if you looked at dinner, you would find that these folks had, in fact, kept their culinary culture quite intact. So that was one of the kind of the daily cycle that became very visible in the 126 households.
Now, when we think about other traditional foods that maybe even Bengalis enjoy, like their sweets, ruskala. Also, when we think of fried namkeens, and also the amount of sweets made with clarified butter or ghee for Diwali and Navratri. I wonder if you can tell us more about that.
Yeah, so these are Bengalis, and these were mostly Hindu Bengalis that I had studied. And so Durga Puja is very important, especially a specific festival, a ritual called Vijaya Dashami, which is the 10th day of the Durga Puja. And that is when you, for instance, the younger generation and the younger cohort goes around to other Bengali households and touch their feet, ask for blessing. And in exchange, you basically get sweets and shingaras. The Bengali word for samosa is shingara. So that was an important part of a ritual. It's, I would say, probably the food that Dr. Shah would not recommend. But this was, remember, this is once a year, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's an important question also of frequency and portion. But that was a very important part of a ritual about being Bengali. In some ways, as important or even more important than say, the ritualization of dinner that I talked about before.
Given what you shared with us, I'm wondering if you can maybe respond to the MASALA study and the findings that Dr. Shah laid out for us.
Yeah, so I really loved the study. I was a little apprehensive because diet has become a very contentious issue in South Asia, and there's a tendency to oversimplify. Meaning kind of there's a bit of magical thinking that either avoiding one food or adding one superfood or becoming a vegetarian is going to solve our problem. And the study shows, after over a decade of study, the MASALA study shows the situation is a lot more complex. And for instance, almost half the participants are vegetarians, but in fact have higher risk factors, partly because of Lucy, the things you mentioned before: fried food, dairy, fat, sugar, especially sugar consumption. So it was really, for me, welcoming to have such a subtle and a complex study that avoided oversimplification, either in terms of a nutrient or in terms of what we should eat or what we should avoid. And the basic question is more physical activity. It recommends, and one of the things is going to be difficult, I think, it recommends is more salads. I'll give an example why salads, even for Indian vegetarians, is a complicated thing. And that's where culture matters. My mother has been a vegetarian for the last 40 years. And she has never had a salad. And partly because Indian notions of cooked food is that salad does not count in the cooked food category. And because she has lived in Balasore in Odisha, a coastal Indian state, and now she lives in Delhi. In India, it is probably protective not to have salads, partly because of contamination of water and produce. So sociologists have studied who study food. Like there's a group, Alan Ward's group in Manchester University. They argue that food is more habitual than available to consciousness and conscious change. They call it kind of a more practice oriented. So one of the challenges in this study, which recommends, for instance, less cooked vegetables, raw vegetables, of course, that is and would be an improvement, dietary improvement in North America. But that I see is going to be a bit of a problem of cultural constructions of what is good to eat and what is edible.
That's an important point, Krishnendu. Dr. Nilesh Shah is still with us. Dr. Shah, I'm wondering if you can respond to what Krishnendu shared.
Absolutely. Well, first, Professor A, I want to say that I completely agree that sometimes I think people look for simple solutions that aren't always so simple if you start digging into them. And I think that that's one of the benefits of how the MASALA program has addressed dietary pattern. But you're absolutely correct. It's not as simple as telling somebody to eat more fruits and vegetables. I guess the first thing I would say is it's particularly important to recognize that the MASALA program represents South Asian Americans. And so there's a lot more to take into account that it includes things like acculturation and length of stay in the U.S. and the environments in which people live. And so I too, like I think Professor Ray would, I too would caution against extrapolating some of the dietary recommendations we might learn from the MASALA study of South Asian Americans beyond the South Asian American population. But to the point that Professor Ray made about the different types of dietary patterns that were identified in the MASALA program, vegetarianism being one of them, I would fully agree that there's often a conflation of healthful foods with vegetarianism, which isn't necessarily the case. And so it does, I think, require much more nuance than asking people if they're eating kind of a more simplistic notion of what a dietary pattern is, like fruits and vegetables and whole grains.
Given what you've learned from the MASALA study so far, Dr. Shah, how has that changed the way you communicate with your patients of South Asian descent, if it has changed at all?
So the first thing that I think that a clinician who's seeing a patient really ought to practice doing is taking a thorough dietary pattern history or asking somebody what they eat. And it's not as easy as just saying, what do you eat every day? And it can be time consuming to do that. But as I think the MASALA program has shown us, the relationship of dietary pattern and food to cardiovascular health and overall health is an important one. And so I've started to be a little bit more detailed in trying to understand what the patterns of different types of foods that people are eating are, both in South Asian and non-South Asian populations. But when I have patients who are South Asian, I try to better understand what the mix of Western style and South Asian style foods are, and try to gently redirect individuals who really lean on the equivalence of vegetarianism being healthy, because there's some recent work in the MASALA program that has confirmed what Professor Ray said, which is that there are both healthy plant-based diets and unhealthy plant-based diets. And of individuals who eat a plant-based diet, of those individuals who consumed a less healthy plant-based diet, which includes predominance of things like fruit juices and refined grains and white potatoes and sugar-sweetened beverages and added sugar to foods, these are foods that are vegetarian, but they're less likely to be healthful. We see more cardiovascular risk factors in those individuals. And so really kind of digging down and understanding what a more daily pattern of eating pattern is becoming increasingly important, I think, in a physician's office.
Frederick's calling in from Woodbridge. Frederick, what's your question or comment?
Sure. One is for I have two questions. One is for Dr. Shah. The visceral adipose tissue in the thoracic area is associated with high risk for cardiovascular disease. Estrogen has been shown in postmenopausal women to prevent accumulation of visceral tissue in the thorax. What is he?
Oh, Frederick, it looks like we're having trouble hearing your full question, but I think I'll paraphrase from our call screener for Dr. Shah. He wanted to know about the use of hormones to prevent heart disease. What can you say there?
No, that's an important question. And what I think I heard Frederick saying is there's some evidence that suggests that the use of hormones like estrogen may reduce the amount of ectopic fat in the thoracic cavity, so in the chest. I would be hesitant to recommend that as a strategy just because I don't think that it's one that's been specifically tested in a clinical trial. I am, however, informed a little bit by some of the evidence from a few decades ago about hormone supplementation for the prevention of heart disease, which did not show a significant benefit. This was primarily in women. And so I can't really extrapolate those findings, but I think that before one could say that would be a effective strategy to reduce the risk in this population, I think that would deserve further study.
I wanted to get back to something that Krishnendu Ray from NYU shared about when we think about raw vegetables and how that may not be a part of a daily meal plan for South Asians. And I'm also thinking about exercise. We played part of that audio from a Punjabi fitness video on the MASALA website, Dr. Shah. But when we think even about lifestyle and expecting maybe people to exercise more, but if it's not part of how they've been brought up, how do you incorporate that, or how do you counsel your patients to maybe adopt more exercise, if they are at higher risk?
Lucy, you're asking me?
Oh, I brought up the point that you made about there are different cultural aspects as well, and so I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about that when we think about exercise. I'll start with Dr. Shah.
Sure. The first thing I think I try to impress upon individuals is that anything is better than nothing. Mm-hmm. And I would say that there certainly is a high level of sedentary behaviors in the South Asian population and probably in non-South Asian populations as well. But the primary encouragement is anything is better than nothing. And I think that there sometimes do seem to be some misconceptions that exercise necessarily requires exercise equipment or exercising at a moderate or really vigorous intensity to the point that someone is sweating and breathless. But I especially for individuals who are starting from a primarily sedentary day-to-day lifestyle, I encourage them to recalibrate their assessment of something like walking for exercise. Walking is spectacular exercise, and I usually will counsel individuals to take a little bit of time when they can fit it in their day, if they are already building in breaks, like at a lunch break, or if they take the bus, getting off a few stops early and getting a few minutes of walking in, and then slowly and gradually building that up. But one other point that you made, Lucy, that I think is important is that there are cultural nuances to exercise that ought to be considered, perhaps primarily in the immigrant South Asian population, but this may be relevant for all. When we think about cultural and gender norms about exercising and exercising in mixed sex spaces, and the expectation of what individuals in different who identify as different genders would be doing. And I think it's kind of incumbent upon us as clinicians, and when I'm thinking about people who work in public health, to help create spaces that would be safe and favorable and culturally appropriate for people to exercise. So the level of physical activity as measured in the MASALA study is relatively low. And so there's certainly room for improvement. And the task, I think, is not only encouraging graduated increases in physical activity, but also identifying culturally adapted strategies or culturally tailored strategies that would align with somebody's conceptualization of the norms in their community of what's appropriate for activity.
And Krishnendu, what's your take?
Yeah, no, that's a very good rule. Something is better than nothing. And I think that's an important takeaway. And one is a cultural thing, and I'm hoping it'll also show up in the MASALA study in terms of generational cohort. I think it's the older immigrant generation that is coming from a culture where physical activity was something you avoided, partly because it was work. It was laborious work. And we have seen that sociological association where you have a lot of physical activity, poor working class people doing it, middle class and upper class people tend to avoid it because it is associated with a certain kind of class activity. So one is that structure of kind of thinking about work and working out has to change, and it is already changing in India with the younger generation. I think the second aspect is an infrastructural aspect that is important. The early part of my study was done from around, I think, Dr. Shah's neighborhood around Chicago, Naperville, which has become an important part of a South Asian population. Suburban communities are often not designed for walking with an interesting landscape or a sidewalk. I had the toughest time. I didn't know when I came to the US, I didn't know how to drive. And I had the toughest time making something an interesting walk because I would often stick out as this guy. What is he doing walking down the side of the road where often there are no sidewalks? So there's an infrastructural issue compared to right now in Manhattan where I live. I walk about 6 miles a day. It is fun and interesting. Sidewalks are fantastic. Now there are even bike lanes, 1,000 kilometers of bike lanes in New York City. Cities are also becoming interesting spaces where we can work out, and South Asians should take advantage of it.
That's an important point. Infrastructure is important too. Again, you're hearing Krishnendu Ray, a professor of food and nutrition studies at New York University, author of The Migrants Table, Meals and Memories in Bengali American Households. He'll stay with us, but I want to thank Dr. Nilesh Shah, cardiologist and faculty at Northwestern University School of Medicine, co-investigator at the MASALA study. You can learn more at our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. To sum it all up, the study, Dr. Shah, was really to help develop a better risk calculator that doctors and others can use to diagnose people more at risk, to understand this population better.
It's certainly work that's being ongoing. And as we follow these individuals for longer, I think we'll learn more about how risk develops over time. And to Professor Ray's point, I think there's a lot left to be learned across generations as well. So we're certainly excited for what we'll learn.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Shah. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Coming up after the break, we talk to a Connecticut dietitian about the conversations she has with South Asian clients about diet and health. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Now, we've been learning today why people of South Asian ancestry living in the U.S. have higher cardiovascular disease risk compared to other racial and ethnic groups. Diet can be a risk factor, but telling someone to avoid certain foods is challenging when food is an important part of a person's culture and identity. Joining us now is a Connecticut dietitian who's worked with South Asian clients. Shraddha Chobi is on the phone with us, a dietitian and nutritionist. She has her own practice, Nutra Edge, and she's president of the Connecticut Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Shraddha, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Sorry, I lost the connection on my Zoom. I hope you all can hear me okay from my phone.
Yes. Yes, we hear you loud and clear. Thank you. So when we think about how you work with your clients, I understand you came up with a food coaching that uses dots for particular food. Can you describe that for us?
Yes, basically, the food coach dot system started with Indian community when I was living in Indiana. So Indian Women Association, they wanted to do a recipe book for the Indian community, and they were asking me if there is any way I can, label those recipes like, heart healthy, diabetic friendly, weight loss kind of recipes, and that gave me, that made me think, what I can do, because you cannot label, one food heart healthy and other food, diabetic friendly or weight friendly. It's it's a combination of basically a diet. And then I did another recipe book for another client, and she had a bunch of recipes from her family, and she wanted to compile all those recipes as a Christmas gift to her family. But all those recipes were like traditional recipes, a lot of fried food and foods high in sugar and made with white flour. And then she also asked same thing that these are traditional recipes I want to preserve, but also I want my family to eat healthy. And these recipes have a lot of emotional involvement, so they might end up eating every day. So that generated the dot system. So basically I put all of my nutrition knowledge and experience into my dot system. So what I came up with, like green dot, yellow dot, green, yellow dot, and red dot food. So green dot foods, basically they are, lower in calories and they are high in nutrients and a good balance of, salt, fat and sugar, and they make, healthy snack. So basically it starts with the calorie, because every calorie matters. Every bite matters. Mm-hmm. So yellow dot foods are also like moderate in calories and high in nutrients. So they make a healthy snack. And green, yellow dot calories, they will provide you enough calories to make a meal. And the interesting thing is our red dot food. So, red dot foods will be, either higher in calories or, low in fiber, high in sugar, high in fat. So basically this food can be healthy in every way, but if it does not have enough fiber, then that would be a red dot. It's more like, brings the awareness, the dot
and
system.
Sujata, thank you for explaining that dot system. It's definitely helpful for people as they think about, foods to prepare and thinking about moderation. But also, I think it's important to say, not all of the food that South Asians eat is considered unhealthy, but the important part is thinking about ways to maybe change up how something is prepared or to eat it in moderation, because as you mentioned and our other guests mentioned, that connection to food and culture is important.
Absolutely. So basically, what I tell to my, Asian, not only Asian clients, to, all the clients. So there are three enemies of your health: is salt, sugar, and fat. No matter what culture you are in, you need to watch these three ingredients. So we need salt, yes, we need sugar, and also we need fat, but it has to be in moderation. And then it's very difficult to explain, how many percent of calories should come from fat, or how much carb you can have, because it becomes very complicated and very intense. So for that reason, I created this dot system. So dot system will tell you, based on the calories you are getting from that food, how much sugar and how much salt and how much fat is a healthy range in there. So my vision when I started this system, it's still in very, preliminary stage. A lot of more work needs to be done. But my vision was, in the grocery store, everywhere, in every box, you should have a dot. Red dot does not mean that it's unhealthy food you need to avoid, but it will bring you it will make people aware, like, hey, it's a red dot because it's low in fiber, or low in, high in sugar, or, high in salt, things like that.
And
Because
thank you for
eating out
describing
is
that,
not-
Shraddha. Krishnendu Ray is still with us from NYU. I mentioned, I believe you're a Bengali, and so I'm wondering if you can just share with us some of your favorite foods to end the show, Krishnendu.
Yeah, I think one common thing is most Indian communities, and here I will extend it South Asian communities, there's a phrase, Hindustani phrase, which says, Kose kose par pani badale chare kose par pani, which is every 2 miles the water changes, every 4 the language. And I think wherever there's a language, it's a geography, and it's also availability of local foods. And so South Asians have a rich repertoire of sautéed greens, greens cooked lightly, say in Bengali specifically. There's a jhal recipe which has fresh ground mustard, and you can add any greens to it and all kinds of vegetable. So I love kind of a chachori, which has various kinds of greens, pumpkins in it, squashes, a little bit of potato too, and then finished with mustard, kind of a chalk, and with pachparan. Pachparan is a Bengali 5-spice that has things like fennel in it, cumin, etc. So there's a rich repertoire all over South Asia of very interesting and good cooked greens, which are already there in our repertoire and contributes to a potentially very healthy diet.
Well, it's been a pleasure to hear from you. And I can't wait to read your book. Again, Krishnendu Ray, he's a professor of food and nutrition studies at NYU, wrote The Migrants Table, Meals and Memories in Bengali American Households. I understand there's some recipes in there too, Krishnendu. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And also thanks to Shraddha Chobi, who's a dietitian and nutritionist, her practice NutriPledge, and president of the Connecticut Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, for joining us here on the show. We thank you for your time as well. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchil. Today's show produced by Sujata Srinivasan with help from our talk show intern, Mira Raju. Our technical director is Kat Pastor. We're back tomorrow. We hope you join us.